one of the cool things.
Yes. Well, we have a good group here, and it's just past 11, it's 15. So I'd like to welcome everyone here to our May meeting of the Upper Hudson chapter of Sisters in Crime. Our informal or fun name is the Mavens of Mayhem.
I love it.
I'm one of the founders of the chapter, and I've served in various capacities, but now I'm a programming chair working with wonderful members to bring you this program and other uh, great programs, as well as people making the chapter thriving to support members in their creative and reading and intellectual pursuits. I'm really thrilled to welcome Jeff Bradway. He and I have connected through the Baker Street Breakfast Club, which is based kind of in Bennington, but also in Western Mass, Pittsfield, where Jeff resides. And Jeff has an amazing background. He's taught history, including at UMass Amherst and Berkshire Community College in Pittsfield. He's involved in historical and musical organizations in the area, and he's members of numerous Sherlockian societies, including the Baker Street Irregulars. If you don't know about that, it's a very prestigious group, and membership is by invitation only. And I believe, Jeff, that they give you a quiz, right, before you are.
No, they actually don't.
Oh, I
The
thought Sally went through one of our
no,
former
well,
members
there are other
went through
groups
some
do.
kind of thing when she went down to New York, but it was
Yeah.
no.
No, it's one of those mysterious Byzantine kind of,
Okay.
processes that nobody really knows.
So we can't talk about that. Anyway, Jeff has written extensively on many topics, including medieval history and local history, and of course on mystery writers, in particular Edgar Allan Poe, and of course Sherlock Holmes. As I mentioned, he's a member of the Baker Street Breakfast Club, and they called themselves that because they would meet at breakfast, and that was founded in 1990. As I said, in the southern Vermont, Bennington, Western Mass, Pittsfield area, they would meet in person. And he edits their quarterly newsletter, which is called Groans, Cries, and Bleatings. It's actually a phrase from the short story, The Adventure of the Red Circle. Holmes makes a reference to the agony columns, which he consults. And he says, these from the London Journal. He says, "Dear me," he said, turning over the pages, "what a chorus of groans, cries, and bleatings. What a ragtag bag of singular happenings." So it's a fun thing. I will be putting the link to the website for the Baker Street Breakfast Club and in the chat so that you can check that out. Jeff has an upcoming publication, and this is a really fun one called Just Desserts, and a regular guide for Sherlock Holmes aficionados. And that is a distillation of the Baker Street Breakfast Club, their 30 years of meetings, into a handbook. And it will help a reader run a Sherlockian meeting or just delving into the world of Sherlock Holmes. They have a synopsis for a short story, a list of characters, places, dates, a limerick that tells the story in 5 lines. Very creative group, the Baker Street Breakfast Club. And they also have topics for discussion, quiz questions, and a dessert recipe, and puzzles. So there's a lot of activities, and you'll be able to get information for that book if any of those things appeal to you, whether it's the Sherlock Holmes information or the dessert recipes. You'll get that on the website. Today, Jeff is speaking about women in Sherlock Holmes, who he calls wily, winning, worldly, and warm-hearted. So I want to welcome Jeff and turn the meeting to him.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, everyone, for attending. One little correction. We called ourselves the Baker Street Breakfast Club because being irregulars, and since that was the only meal we didn't have our meetings at, we decided, Sally and the other group decided to call it that. I joined them about, oh gosh, about 15, 16 years ago. I had met Sally Sugarman down at a Baker Street Irregulars dinner, and she was actually sitting next to me when I got my investiture, which was a lot of fun. And she said, do you have a Sherlock Holmes Society in Western Mass? And I said, no. She said, well, come and join ours. So the rest is history. So I tried to pitch this little essay to people with a general knowledge of Sherlock Holmes, and I tried to combine it with my interests in history. I was going to be a Victorian historian, liked it because it rhymed, but I ended up being sidetracked into medieval history when I got to college. But the Victorians loved their medievalism, so, it all kind of worked out. So today we're going to talk about women in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And we may think of Sherlock Holmes's world as one largely dominated by men with, women here and there. But there are a great many women in the 60 stories that we have from the pen of Dr. Watson. So today I'd like to talk a bit about the status of women in the mid to late Victorian period, including what expectations were put on them by society, what occupations they could undertake, and what consequences they might face if they transgressed societal norms. And then I'll look at the Sherlock Holmes stories to see how these things are reflected in them using specific women to do so. Quick warning, there will be some spoilers, but it's hard to avoid them. So the 19th century was a period of immense and unprecedented economic, social, and political change. The Industrial Revolution brought huge wealth to some, a better standard of living to many, and abject misery to many more. Jobs appeared which had never existed before, while others went the way of the dinosaur. The population, which since time immemorial had centered around agriculture and small trades in the countryside and small towns, shifted rapidly to a factory-based one located in cities, which quickly became densely populated, dangerous, and unhealthy. For the lower classes, both men and women could find work in mills. They could also be servants to middle and upper class families. If they were down on their luck, they might resort to crime or to prostitution. Those who were better off, clerks, salespeople, professionals running the gamut from lawyers to engineers to doctors, made up a new middle class which benefited from a higher standard of living and whose manners and morals began to shape public attitudes and behaviors. At the top, of course, were the very well-off, the traditional aristocracy whose wealth was based on land, and the new rich, industrialists, whose wealth was derived from both the wonders and the excesses of the Industrial Revolution. Now, for middle-class women, what developed was a so-called cult of domesticity. And this development was centered around home life, raising children, running the household. Women were seen as reflections of their husband's position in society. A successful man of business had a wife who did not have to work, who could stay at home, and could cultivate the finer aspects of middle-class life, engaging in activities which she might shine, like music, art, and so forth. But she could only do so among family and friends, never in public. There was no real public life for these women. Now, the very word Victorian conjures up in our minds prudishness and moral rectitude. References to sex, desire, and the activities that go along with those were eliminated from public discourse, or else heavily disguised, except, of course, when the speaker or writer was denouncing them. Human nature being what it is, however, this attitude led to hypocrisy on a mass scale, as many people, particularly in the middle and upper classes, lived lives of conspicuous rectitude in public, but who were guilty, quote unquote, at least in the eyes of society, of disreputable practices in private. The major outgrowth of these attitudes was the demonization of almost all outside activities undertaken by women and the black and white distinction that was drawn between women who were praised as domestic angels and those who were condemned as wanton harlots. Oftentimes, women's activities outside the home were said to have deleterious effects on them, with similar issues being mysteriously absent in the male population. One example of this is the increase of the use by women of the bicycle, a hobby made more popular in part by being made more comfortable with the invention of the pneumatic inner tube in the late 1880s. Quite apart from the obvious problem of the freedom and independence the bicycle gave to women, with it, after all, they could go anywhere. Women even started to wear a shocking new style of clothing, bloomers, baggy trouser-like garments designed to allow them to straddle the bicycle, itself a very suggestive position. So-called experts claimed that women's use of the bicycle led to horrible physiological problems. One claim was that female cyclists would be unable to have children because of the pressure the seat exerted on their nether regions. Another warning that circulated was the fact that frequent bicycle riding, and particularly the effort that it took to push on the pedals, gave women a very unattractive bicycle face. All such arguments, of course, were really nothing but red herrings meant to conceal the patriarchal need of Victorian men to control their women. Professions for women were few in Victorian society. True, one might encounter a Wilma Norman Neruda, the real-life violin virtuoso whose concert Sherlock Holmes attends in A Study in Scarlet, but she was by birth a bohemian, a foreigner. And foreigners, particularly foreign women, occupy a special place in the Holmes tales. They are generally presented as exotic, wild, undisciplined, impulsive, and passionate. Everything a good English girl should not be. There are no homegrown women barristers, doctors, or other professionals in the Sherlock Holmes stories. That said, during the later Victorian era, new occupations did begin to appear that were created by rapid advancements in technologies and that were deemed genteel enough to be open to women. Unmarried women, of course. Among these opportunities were jobs such as those of typist, telephone operator, governess, teacher, and shop assistant. Another outgrowth of the strict attitudes of society toward women was the condemnation and punishment of any perceived wrongdoing on their parts. The middle and upper class Victorian woman, who however briefly strayed sexually or even merely romantically, always had to worry about possible blackmail, because a good reputation was everything to the Victorians. Of all fallen women in Victorian society, perhaps none was looked down upon more than prostitutes, or streetwalkers as they were known, the very antithesis of the good wife or daughter in her home. Very few gave them a second thought, unless their existence obtruded into the general consciousness, as in the case of the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. As women slowly became more prominent in the workplace, and as they became more educated through the introduction of elementary education laws, they were granted some rights and diligently pursued even more. Perhaps the greatest advances in promoting women's independence were the Married Women's Property Acts, passed by Parliament between 1870 and 1907. Prior to these laws, a single woman could own property, enter contracts, and sue in court. Once married, however, she could no longer do anything independently. She was regarded as being one with her husband. In fact, before these acts, married women held the same legal status as criminals, minors, and the insane. While the Married Women's Property Acts gradually granted women greater control over at least some aspects of their lives, other advances, such as divorce law reform and the granting of women's suffrage, would not come until much later, after the First World War. One aspect of the Sherlock Holmes stories that has struck me is the early introduction of women who have some autonomy. Mary Morstan, the client in The Sign of the Four, for example, is a young lady who has had to make her way in the world after the death of her father. She becomes a governess in the household of Mrs. Cecil Forrester. While technically a servant, Morstan is treated by her employer as a close friend. Seeing the two of them in the half-opened door of the Forrester home, Dr. Watson said that they represented to him, quote, a tranquil English home in the midst of the wild, dark business which had absorbed us, end quote. Sherlock Holmes, of course, has a different opinion of the pair. Women are never to be entirely trusted, not the best of them. Then, in The Scandal in Bohemia, the first installment of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the reader encounters the most astounding of all the female characters to face the great detective, the redoubtable Irene Adler. Over the years, many commentators and pastiche writers have tried to make Irene Adler a love interest for Holmes. This completely misses the mark, however. At the outset of the story, Dr. Watson explicitly states, to Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. I have seldom heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irene Adler. Now, Dr. Watson, as my friend Sally Sugarman always liked to remind us, is an unreliable narrator. Whether it's his trouble remembering just where his war wound is, or why he has his wife call him James on one occasion, or in what month the Sign of the Four actually takes place, he certainly gives his readers pause when they come across some new anomaly. However, when Watson tells us that Irene Adler was the woman to Sherlock Holmes, but that he did not feel love for her, I think we can believe him. For Sherlock Holmes, Adler was the Platonic ideal, the perfect example of his conception of what the best woman would be. Intelligent, shrewd, talented, bold, honorable, and yes, beautiful. And Holmes repeatedly demonstrates why Irene Adler is for him so different from other women. In the case of The Second Stain, a case from around the same time, Holmes, in rather Henry Higgins-like fashion, declares with great frustration, the motives of women are so inscrutable. How can you build on such a quicksand? Their most trivial action may mean volumes, or their most extraordinary conduct may depend upon a hairpin or curling tongs. A decade or so later, in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, Holmes confirms that he had not felt love for Adler, saying flatly, I have never loved Watson. And late in life, after his retirement to the South Downs of Sussex, Holmes wrote, women have seldom been an attraction to me, for my brain has always governed my heart. All this being said, Sherlock Holmes always treated women well. For example, in the case of Identity, the third short story published, a case which featured Mary Sutherland, he, quote, welcomed her with the easy courtesy for which she was remarkable. Sutherland exemplifies many of the aspects of women's changing place in Victorian society. To begin with, she is an heiress in a minor way, earning £100 a year in interest from New Zealand stock. She's also a typist, by which occupation she can make upwards of £50 to £60 a year. On this sum alone, Holmes remarks, a single lady can get on very nicely. Of course, Mary has been a good daughter, read pliant here. So she has always allowed her mother and stepfather the use of her inherited income. A problem arises, however. Mary would like to get out in the social world and meet people of her own age and status. If she does, however, she might just meet a prospective husband and take her money with her. Facing the loss of her income and the lifestyle it supports, Her parents connive to keep her single and attached to them. The stepfather, who's only 5 years older than Mary, disguises himself as Mr. Hosmer Angel. What a name. Angel quickly presses his suit, wooing Mary with alacrity and finally proposing marriage to her, all to wind up disappearing mysteriously on the day of the ceremony. Mary vows to wait for him, thus playing into her parents' hands. Sherlock Holmes quickly solves the mystery of the groom's disappearance. He doesn't even have to leave his sitting room to do so. After confronting the wicked stepfather, however, he decides not to inform Mary of the truth, saying that it's dangerous to snatch a delusion from a woman. Now, about the most charitable thing that could possibly be said about this decision is that he fears that Mary might become unhinged if she finds out the truth, which could lead her to commit some extreme, perhaps violent act. This interpretation would certainly be in line with the paternalistic attitude of Victorians towards their women. They were seen as the weaker vessels, after all, and prone to extremes of behavior. It should not be surprising to learn that the term hysteria was actually coined at this time, and that it has its origin in the Greek word for uterus. This plot device, the father figure who tries to bilk his daughter of her money, is something of a motif in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Two other young women come to the detective with cases very similar in nature to Mary Sutherland's. There is Helen Stoner in The Speckled Band. She complains of hearing strange sounds at night, the same sounds heard by her twin sister Julia prior to her mysterious death 2 years before. Julia and Helen have been living with their stepfather, Dr. Roylott, a dangerous man to fall foul of, as he himself tells Sherlock Holmes. The women's mother has passed away, and all her money has been left in Roylott's control while her daughters live with him. What precipitates the action of the story is Julia's announcement of her engagement to be married. Now remember, if she does so, she would take the share of the estate with her, her share. Soon thereafter, she dies. Now Helen has announced her intention to marry, and suddenly she is forced, by repairs undertaken to the house, to sleep in the very bed that her sister had. And she has begun to hear those strange sounds herself. Of course, Dr. Roylott proves to be the killer. His motive is clearly the retention of his stepdaughter's inheritance. Additionally, some have interpreted his method of murder, the introduction of a snake through a hole into a bedchamber the women have been forced to sleep in, has been seen as a symbolic rape, a further example of his power over the young women. A third example of the motif takes place in the Copper Beeches, where Violet Hunter has had to make her way in the world as a governess, lately under rather strange circumstances. She informs Sherlock Holmes that Mr. Rucastle, her employer, has made her cut her red hair quite short and wear a certain blue dress as part of the conditions of her employment. He's willing to pay her above the going rate if she will do so. Now, if that isn't weird enough, once at the Copper Beeches, his home in the country, Violet accidentally finds a long coil of red hair matching the color of her own. What can it all mean? Well, it's the same story again. Rucastle has tried to make his daughter Alice sign away her inheritance to him before he will allow her to marry. Under the strain of his constant pressuring, she falls victim to brain fever, that mysterious ailment so beloved of Victorian authors. In order to convince her suitor that she has become indifferent to him, Rucastle uses Violet as a decoy to shoo the suitor away. Violet Smith, throughout the story, is bright and resourceful, as Sherlock Holmes himself admits, and she actually takes part in the resolution of the case. Of course, Watson, the romantic, hopes that some kind of relationship might develop between the detective and the governess. But after the case ends, Holmes exhibits no further interest in her. In The Solitary Cyclist, we find yet another variation on the theme. Here the client is Violet Smith. Yes, another Violet. Conan Doyle was fond of the name. She's a music teacher. Out of the blue, she's approached by Mr. Carruthers, a gentleman who lives out in the country, quite some distance from London. Back in Australia, he was a friend of her uncle, who he says died without a penny. The uncle's dying wish was that his friend make sure Violet is taken care of financially. Carruthers hires her as a music teacher for his daughter. As part of her employment agreement, Carruthers agrees that she can travel to London and back each weekend in order to visit her widowed mother. The truth of the matter is that the uncle actually died rich, that Violet is his heir, and that Carruthers wants to marry her in order to have access to her money. In this story, there are many elements of the so-called new woman, as such independent young females came to be known. Violet works for a living. She also travels unaccompanied by train and by bicycle to a man's home some distance from London. What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot. Thank goodness she doesn't suffer from bicycle face, but she does attract unwanted attention in the form of a male cyclist who consistently follows her along a country road and another odious man who forces marriage on her. While she's brave enough to turn her bicycle around and chase the first, she is unable to fight off the second. The moral of the story seems to be clear. A young, unprotected woman acting independently, using popular modern forms of transport, can get into some serious trouble. Another theme in the Holmes stories is blackmail, which, as we have seen, was a common crime in tight-laced Victorian society. Two of Sherlock Holmes's cases involving blackmail come readily to mind: The Second Stain and Charles Augustus Milverton. Interestingly, in neither case does Holmes himself directly resolve the problem at hand. It is the victim who does so. In The Second Stain, Holmes is charged with recovering a letter written by a certain foreign potentate, whose contents are so inflammatory that their revelation could embroil England in a great war. The letter was stolen from the dispatch box, a kind of locked briefcase belonging to the Honorable Trelawney Hope, the Secretary for European Affairs. Holmes argues that 3 men in London may have committed the crime. The question is, when and how? The dispatch box was in Trelawney Hope's possession until he returned safely home, and then it remained still locked in his second-story bedroom. It turns out that Eduardo Lucas, one of the 3 men mentioned, was indeed responsible for the crime, but he did it through Trelawney Hope's wife, Lady Hilda. He was blackmailing her, having in his possession a letter of hers, an indiscreet letter, a foolish letter, a letter of an impulsive, loving girl written before my marriage, she tells Holmes. To show how reputation meant all to the Victorian elite, despite the fact that the letter was written before her marriage, her husband, to use her own words, would have thought it criminal. In exchange for the potentate's letter, Lucas will let Lady Hilda get her own letter back. Using a duplicate key, she steals the letter from her husband's dispatch box, then conveys it to Lucas's house, witnesses where he hides it, and leaves with her own letter. Later, after Lucas's murder, in which she plays no part other than as a witness, Lady Hilda very boldly and ingeniously gains re-entry to the house and takes the potentate's letter back. In the end, she turns the letter over to Sherlock Holmes, who manages to slip it back into her husband's dispatch box unobserved. He chooses not to expose Lady Hilda. His only explanation for how the letter appeared was an enigmatic, "We too have our diplomatic secrets." In the case of Charles Augustus Milverton, Holmes represents Lady Eva Brackwell, a young debutante about to be married. She desperately wants to retrieve a sprightly letter that she wrote back from Milverton, the king of all the blackmailers, the worst man in London, who fills Sherlock Holmes with a creeping, shrinking sensation, similar to that caused by the serpents at the zoo. Note the Old Testament allusion to Eve's temptation and fall in the Garden of Eden. Holmes remarks that the 50 murderers whom he has encountered during his career do not fill him with the repulsion he feels for Milverton. It's worth quoting Holmes at length. Heaven help the man, and still more the woman, whose secret and reputation come into the power of Milverton. With a smiling face and a heart of marble, he will squeeze and squeeze until he has drained them dry. How could one compare the ruffian who in hot blood bludgeons his mate with this man who methodically and at his leisure tortures the soul and wrings the nerves in order to add to his already swollen money bags? Milverton demands £7,000, a sum that Lady Eva cannot afford. Holmes offers £2,000, an amount Milverton rejects. To Holmes's argument that, quote, "Surely it is better for you to take the substantial sum which I offer than to ruin Lady Eva's career, which can profit you in no way," Milverton replies, "An exposure would profit me indirectly to a considerable extent. I have 8 or 10 similar cases maturing. If it was circulated among them that I had made a severe example of the Lady Eva, I should find all of them much more open to reason." After unsuccessfully trying to grab Milverton's notebook, which appears to contain many incriminating documents, Holmes resolves to take another tack. Disguised as a plumber, he cultivates the attentions and affections of Milverton's housemaid, Agatha, in order to learn about her master's habits and the layout of his house. Watson and many commentators have found this ploy deplorable, and it certainly is. Possibly it shows an attitude of superiority on Holmes's part to a woman of a lower social rank than he, but it certainly goes far to show how powerless Holmes feels in this case. What can he do to stop the blackmailer? Until Milverton somehow were to blackmail an innocent person, who is there among his victims who would dare to expose him? Holmes's desperation leads him to decide that the only answer is to burgle Milverton's house and steal the incriminating letter from his safe. However, before he can succeed at this small, targeted solution to the problem at hand, one of the blackmailer's earlier victims calls on him in disguise and throws his foul deeds in his face, venting her anger and humiliation. In reply to Milverton's assertion that he can rouse the whole house against her, she draws a pistol from her dress and shoots him dead, crying, "You will ruin no more lives as you ruined mine. You will wring no more hearts as you wrung mine. I will free the world of a poisonous thing. Take that, you hound, and that, and that, and that." As a final coup de grace, she crushes her heel into his face as she leaves. Now, Holmes and Watson remain hidden throughout this encounter and do nothing either to stay the woman's hand or to stop her from fleeing. Vengeance has given a victim the strength to confront Milverton in a way that Sherlock Holmes could not. To make up for the preemption of his own plan, Holmes and Watson make the woman's action all the more decisive by clearing out Milverton's safe and throwing its contents into the fire. Now no one else will be able to prey on victims using Milverton's weapons. At the story's end, when Inspector Lestrade calls on Holmes to get his help in solving the murder, The detective declines, saying, "I'm afraid I can't help you, Lestrade. The fact is that I knew this fellow Milverton, that I considered him one of the most dangerous men in London, and that I think there are certain crimes which the law cannot touch, and which therefore, to some extent, justify private revenge." In both the case of Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope and that of Lady Eva Brackwell, Holmes has advised the lady to confide in her male partner. Given the strict attitudes of the day, however, Lady Hilda refuses, and it is certain that Lady Hilda refuses, and it's certain that Lady Eva would have done so as well. Perhaps the one true female villain in the entirety of the 60 Sherlock Holmes tales is the haughty Isadora Klein in the story The Three Gables. And yet even she does her evil out of desperation. Her story is this. In the past, as Holmes explains, she was the celebrated beauty. Then she married the aged German sugar king Klein, and presently found herself the richest, as well as the most lovely widow upon earth. Then there was an interval of adventure when she pleased her own tastes. Sound familiar? She had several lovers, and Douglas Maberly, one of the most striking men in London, was one of them. For Maberly, their association was not just a passing fancy as it was to her. When she drops him, he persists. From the towering vantage point of her self-absorption and the massive sense of entitlement she feels, Klein cannot believe that he, a penniless commoner, as she puts it, actually thinks he can marry her. Growing tired of the situation, she has Maberly beaten in order to drive him away. Additionally, she has realized, as Watson put it, that she had, quote, come to that time of life when even the proudest beauty finds the half-light more welcome. She's getting on in years, and she's anxious to marry again in order to secure her social and financial situation, and she has her eye on the Duke of Lomond, a young man young enough to be her son. In the meantime, Maberly finally comes to realize that Klein is the proverbial belle dame sans merci. Seeking his revenge on her, he writes a scandalous expose of their relationship and its aftermath. He sends her a copy and tells her that the other is going to his publisher, but he dies before being able to carry out his plan. Desperate that there be no scandal, Klein must find that second copy and destroy it. She even goes to the extent of attempting to purchase the home of Maberly's elderly mother, along with all of its contents, in the hopes that she may find the manuscript still there. She does succeed in obtaining it. But when Holmes and Watson seek to get it from her, she shows them its ashes in the fire of her Arabian Nights drawing room. Isadora Klein is a character of amazing privilege and entitlement. She is used to getting what she wants and believes that she deserves all of it. Of Maberly's book, she asks, apparently without a bit of irony, could I have believed that a gentleman would do such an act? Likewise, she cannot believe that Sherlock Holmes will turn her over to the authorities, saying, no, you would not. You are a gentleman. It is a woman's secret. To Klein, the whole affair revolves around her needs and her wants alone. She goes on to argue, you must look at it with my eyes, Mr. Holmes. You must realize it from the point of view of a woman who sees all her life's ambition about to be ruined at the last moment. Is such a woman to be blamed if she protects herself? With a final heartfelt plea, she says, granting that I was too hard on Douglas, and God knows I am sorry for it, what else could I do? At this, as in many other cases, Holmes takes the law into his own hands, agreeing not to reveal her wrongs, on condition that she pay for a round-the-world trip for Maberly's mother. Essentially, he's blackmailing her. In parting, though, he wags a cautionary finger at her, saying, lady, Have a care. Have a care. You can't play with edged tools forever without cutting those dainty hands. I'd like to finish this essay on women in the Sherlock Holmes stories by returning to Irene Adler. In addition to mistakenly trying to make her a love interest for Sherlock Holmes, most later depictions also make her a villain. I do not consider her a villain. She is an adventuress. My favorite definition of that term is a woman who seeks dangerous or exciting experiences. This describes Irene Adler to a T. She commits no crime in a scandal in Bohemia. Yes, she threatens to send the photograph of herself and the king to his fiancée once the marriage is announced. There's nothing criminal in that. It's her photograph, after all. Indeed, all the wrongs in this case are committed against Irene Adler. The king admits that he tried 5 times to recover the photograph, which, remember, is the lady's property. And then there are Holmes and Watson, who between them enter her house on false pretenses and then create the illusion of a fire and the panic that ensues as a diversion in order to do the same thing, to find the location of the photo. Irene Adler's real crime, if you will, is that she is a figure outside of the assigned and accepted roles of Victorian English society. For one, she's American. Oh my word. For another, she is a successful opera diva, a performer on the stage. She has also been a king's mistress, and to top it all off, she dresses in men's clothing. As she tells Holmes in her farewell letter, male costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the freedom which it gives. There is that frightening word again, freedom. Irene Adler has taken her life into her own hands and made it into what she wants. She has not accepted being forced into the mold that society has foisted upon her. Irene Adler is, when you think about it, a perfect counterpart to Sherlock Holmes himself. He himself is unique. As he tells Watson in A Study in Scarlet, their very first adventure together, I have a trade of my own. I'm a consulting detective, the only one in the world. In The Sign of the Four, the next story published, he states, I am the last and highest court of appeal in detection. Watson long regards him as an isolated phenomenon, and for a time actually believes that he's an orphan with no relatives living. Adding to this aura of uniqueness, Watson says that Holmes, quote, loathed every form of society with his whole bohemian soul. An interesting term to use, don't you think, given the double meaning of that term in the Irene Adler case? Holmes himself acknowledges his dislike of society in a somewhat Oscar Wildean fashion during the case of the noble bachelor. On opening a letter from Lord Robert St. Simon, he says, oh, this looks like one of those unwelcome social summonses which call upon a man either to be bored or to lie. Like Irene Adler, Sherlock Holmes prefers living a life outside the usual conventions. His life, as he says, is spent in one long effort to escape from the commonplaces of existence. The difference between Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler comes down to the simple fact that one was a man and the other a woman. Characteristics that are acceptable society in one of them condemns the other in its eyes. In Dr. Watson's own words, one was the best and the wisest man whom I have ever known, while the other was a woman of dubious and questionable memory. There are many other notable women whom I could discuss in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Mrs. Hudson, the landlady, for example. They are good or bad or strong or weak, active or passive, as varied as the population at large. But I will leave my story here and ask all of you to look into these tales yourself with a fresh eye for those truths about Victorian society that lurk there, waiting for the observant reader to discover them. The end.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. I
Ah,
love how you began with a, a very comprehensive overview of the Victorian society and women's position in that. And um, I mean, distilling it
mhm,
without having a whole dissertation, but hitting on the key points about um, the angel in the house and the dichotomy and how the different things that happened and even the invention of the bicycle helped women become more independent, but at the same time were punished for it or looked down upon that. Um, I really like the idea of Irene Adler and also Lady Eva Brackwell is really taking agency, you know,
mhm.
to 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 get that photograph to trick Holmes, Irene Adler, and also Lady Brackwell to kill Silverton. So I really like that aspect, as well as people like Violet Hunter and also Violet Smith, as you said, one of
One of the many
Conan Doyle's
violets.
favorite names, right? But both being um, employed, so in one of the jobs that were
Mhm.
acceptable, but also having like Violet Smith riding the bicycle, taking the train, um, going back and forth, and trying at least um, to confront the solitary cyclist, the one that was following her, and then Violet Hunter actually doing a lot of the investigative work
Right.
um, while she was there. So I think that was just amazing, all the different pieces that you put in there. Do we have any other, do we have questions for Jeff? I think we're not too large. You could probably unmute and ask if you have a question. We're getting some comments about some people
Thank
have
you,
to leave,
Dina.
but but it was interesting.
No,
Any other?
it's a fascinating topic, one that I hadn't really looked into so much. But when I started doing some research, I mean, if you go online, you can find all sorts of academic papers that have been written about women and in Sherlock Holmes and their conditions and so forth. They go into really great detail and really fine analyses of what women were going through during this period. It's one thing to have a society where women are seen as second-class citizens, and it's another to have that same situation in a society when women are starting to develop ideas of their own, if you will, through education and exposure to the world outside. And suddenly, you know, this is no longer okay. We have to do something about this, and there's a good, 50 to 80 year period where this all takes place, and there are those stories that you read of, Victorian husbands who had their women, had their wives, incarcerated in insane asylums. And you think, well, how could that be? Well, if the woman has the same legal status as an insane person, you can see that it doesn't take much. And that argues for a very real power of men over women. And I have to say, in all these years, I mean, I've been interested in Sherlock Holmes since the age of 5. That the whole thing with Dr. Roylott and the snake and the ventilator and all that being symbolic of rape never once occurred to me. But once having read it, it's like, yeah, I could see that. I don't know if that's how Conan Doyle saw it, if it was, you know, subconscious on his part, but nevertheless, a very powerful symbol.
That was a new idea for
Hmm.
me too.
Yeah,
I
I saw
didn't,
that and I said, I can't
yeah,
leave that out. I got to find
yeah,
a place
no.
for that.
It's interesting and scholars and critics will read a lot into things and maybe they resonate or not. Do you have a sense of how Conan Doyle felt? I mean, I don't want to ask an unfair
Hmm.
question. He's recording, of course, social
Yes, yeah.
events, but how he felt about
Well,
women.
I think he sees things somewhat in the same line as Sherlock Holmes. Certainly in later years, he was very active in the divorce law reform movement. He thought that the divorce laws were very unfair. Women basically, unless they could absolutely prove infidelity on the part of their husbands, they had no recourse. And in one of the stories, The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, Holmes has the woman in the case essentially say that the divorce laws are wicked and that, something has to change. She's been forced to live with a husband who is an alcoholic and violent and so forth, and she had no way to get out of it other than what eventually happens: the husband gets murdered. And Conan Doyle was very influenced by his home life, particularly his youth growing up. His mother had to raise him and his siblings on her own. She had a boarding house. His father was an epileptic and an alcoholic, and he was confined to an asylum. So the mother was everything. She was the one who instilled Conan Doyle with his romantic storytelling abilities, because she would just rattle off these stories of, the history of the family and, tales of daring do and so forth. And that's what Conan Doyle wanted to replicate in his own career. And the things that he particularly valued among his own writings were the historical tales, the White Company, and things like that. He really didn't think much of these Sherlock Holmes stories. But that's in part because for him they were so easy to write. He could sit down in an afternoon and write a story. He could be sitting in the middle of a party and be sitting at his desk writing one of these stories down. So he didn't think that, he should deserve all this credit because they really weren't that hard. But they do reflect many of his attitudes regarding society, regarding inequities in society. And I mean, just almost any story you can look at and find some picture of Victorian society that has some commentary on it.
Well, that's wonderful. And I knew a little bit about Conan Doyle, but I didn't know about his work with the divorce law reform. So that's really fascinating. And also um, his home life, about his father and
Mhm.
the mother being such an influence. I knew
Yeah,
that he did value his romantic fiction like the White Company more, and his
right.
spiritualism
Yeah,
he got much more involved in.
Conan Doyle's family was very talented. They were artistic.
Wow.
One of them was the art editor for Punch magazine.
Wow.
And his father was kind of the odd one out. He was very talented himself, but he he's basically known these days for his drawings of fairies and things like that. Very whimsical things, but one imagines that these were the sort of things that he was seeing in his head. I saw there was a
Mm.
question about divorce. Conan Doyle was married twice. His first wife, Louise, Tui as he called her, developed consumption. She had a lingering disease of tuberculosis, and he did a lot to try to alleviate the symptoms of this. Going to the Alps to try to clear her lungs, going to Egypt, you know, building a house out in the countryside away from London, all these things. He was very devoted to her. But at some point during her illness, he developed a friendship with the woman who ended up being his second wife, Jean. She was considerably younger than he, and we really aren't certain what kind of relationship they did have while Conan Doyle was still married. It may have been platonic, but there may have been assignations in London or whatever. Finally, Tui dies of consumption, and after the year of mourning that was traditional, Jean and Arthur Conan Doyle married, and they were married for the rest of his life up until 1930. And she had a great influence on him. She being younger than he was an active person. She went with him everywhere, particularly during his spiritualist wanderings around the world. She basically, in at least a couple of stories, we have the manuscripts. He dictated parts of stories to her, and she wrote them down. You can see the change in the handwriting, and she suggested alterations and so forth. So he he was a romantic with the big capital R, and he believed in marriage. He believed in the commitment of marriage, but he also understood that there are gray areas, and one can have a beloved spouse and yet still feel attraction to another person who perhaps can engage in life more actively.
Well, it's interesting that with both his father and with his first wife, that he had to face
Mhm.
illnesses. I mean, severe, crippling illnesses. That's really interesting.
One of the
I
things I
know
read,
some. Oh,
one
go
of the
ahead.
things I read about with regard to bicycling was that someone commented, and I wish I had their ear when they wrote this, commented that Conan Doyle and his wife, the first wife, would go out cycling.
Oh,
Well, the truth is that she didn't go out cycling. He had a special bicycle made. It was essentially a tricycle, and kind of in reverse with the two wheels in front, and she had a seat there, and he would bicycle her around the countryside. So in that case, it wasn't an example of the woman's independence, but rather the husband's desire to include his wife in this sort of activity. So
so not even in tandem where she's pedaling a little bit.
nope,
She's
nope.
being
Well,
carted around.
we wouldn't want her to get bicycle face. No.
Right. That's great. And again, this my particular interest is I didn't really understand that only single women could own property and sue and things like that. I did work in the Anglo-Saxon area where era was when women had a lot more power,
Hmm.
and then the church came in with their notions,
Yeah.
and that disappeared. So it's really interesting just to know that fact about the 19th century. So thank you for that.
So,
Any other questions? Any last words, Jeff? We've had a big chunk of your time. It's been fascinating, really
oh,
wonderful.
it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I always like a challenge, a challenge to do something different with something that I have a lot of experience with, and so this
Yeah.
was really a lot of fun.
Well,
All I can say is, in addition to your other readings, pick up the complete Sherlock Holmes every once in a while and pick a story. You know,
mm,
a lot of people think the later ones are of lesser quality than the earlier ones, but even in those, there's something to find. Usually, even if the mystery isn't so great, the writing usually makes up for it through Conan Doyle's imagery or analogies and so forth. It really is a lot of fun.
no, it's really been a pleasure. I put links into our June program. We have the wonderful author and instructor Ellen Byron, talking about humor hacks from a sitcom vet, June 21st, 11:15. And then if you want to look at the programs for the rest of the year, you can go to the main link for our programs. I want to thank everyone for being here. And I did put the link in for the Baker Street Breakfast Club, so you can see more of Jeff's work and also a lot more about Sherlock Holmes. And again, thank you so much, Jeff. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all. I
Great.
really appreciate the opportunity.
It's a great program, and we do put it on YouTube, as I mentioned, and we can share that with people in your world as
Great.
well as. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody. Good weekend. And
Bye-bye.
I hope to see you in June. Bye.